What's going on, everyone? I'm having some slight internet problems at the moment, so I'm working those out. Just give me just a second. We're operating at a lower bit rate on the stream just because my internet can't seem to handle the normal 10K, so we're at like 3,000. Hopefully it doesn't affect too much. We're just trying to not drop frames, because if frames drop during the stream, then the audio won't be in sync with the video, so that's not good. So we'll do the best we can here. Oh, left audio only. I can fix that. Sorry about that. I actually had the wrong one enabled, so it should be fine now. It should be right and left now. My bad. Okay. Nine, 10. All right. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so the video today we're doing, of course, the state of mobile development in 2019. So I'm gonna go over some like channel meta kind of topics. If you have any questions about things related to mobile development, things like iOS or Android, or the history of the such, any development tools, as well as any challenges that are related to kind of mobile development, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll attempt to answer them all here on the stream. So it's going to talk about a couple meta topics. Start putting your questions in the comments if you'd like. So first is the 250,000 video. That's coming along fine. I expect to publish that soon. Just recording video and then going to get that worked out. The new live stream schedule, as you know, everything is planned kind of ahead of time right now. So if you want to see the schedule, it's on Discord. I also make public the upcoming 2 streams. So you should have saw this one and then the one after it. And I think this will be good for everybody to just know kind of what's coming up in the pipe for the streams. And then you can attend the ones you want to attend and don't attend the ones you don't want to. Hopefully you come to them all, but you'll have the option to know what's ahead of time now. This is kind of a call for projects. The very last stream I'm going to do is called fan project review. And so because of that, I need actual fan projects. And I have a few that people have sent me over the last, probably a couple months. But if you want to get your project on this stream live, send a project that you've done to projectreview@engineerman.org. And I'll put that email in the description. And then what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to review, I'm going to review for probably 30 or 40 minutes. I could probably do at least 10, 12, somewhere around there. So if you have a really cool project that you've built, make sure you send that over. It does have to be open source, because I'm not just going to run a random compiled binary. So I need to be able to see exactly what I'm running. I should be able to build it from source and then show it on the screen. So if you have something really cool, now's your time to send it over. And if you're watching the stream on a recording, I'll ask for the projects, every stream after, up until the project review, which will be, I think, the very end of December. I think December 28th is when that's going to be. Next is the Rust series is underway, and a lot of people reached out and said, yeah, I'm really interested in learning Rust. That's really cool. It's a cool language. And so know that I'm going to be putting out 2 videos a week for that. The next one will be tomorrow, and then the one after that will be Wednesday. I'm going to try to put out a video on Wednesdays if I don't have a live stream coming up that weekend, and hopefully that'll get that series done. I expect that to be around 10 videos. But I got a lot of content for it. I've been learning Rust myself, of course. We're going to learn it together. So, yeah, it'll be good. My project prints hello world. It is not open source, however. JK, good idea. Looking forward to seeing the submissions. Yeah, the last time I used to do project review as a video, and a lot of people sent me some really cool stuff, and like a real broad range of things too. I wasn't really sure what I was going to get, but I ended up getting a lot of cool stuff. So I hope that happens again. This time I'll be able to review a lot more, and it'll be nice. Also, thank you for the 10 French fruits. I appreciate that. Longtime supporter of the channel. Thanks a lot. It means a lot to me. Yep, Rust is baller. Most sought after language, to be honest. Yep, you're right. Okay, next thing is I was going to put out that YouTube is stripping a lot of creators of their verified checkmark, but they actually reversed course this morning. Everybody went nuclear over the situation, and now they're letting everybody keep the verified checkmark if they already had it. So I was going to put out that, you know, they're going to take it away. So, you know, don't think if you don't see the checkmark that I'm the fake person or whatever. You know, it's still possible that YouTube will reverse course, but as of right now, they are giving everybody the check mark back that used to have it, so you shouldn't have to worry about anything. Then the last thing is there's a small bug going around YouTube about like washed out thumbnails, and my channel is one of those affected. A lot of my thumbnails for only some people are very bright and very washed out, making the text hard to see. It doesn't seem to be a problem for people on mobile, but it's a huge problem for people on desktop. A couple people have reported it to me. It's also been reported on Reddit for other channels, so it's definitely something that's related to the actual platform itself. And that's it for all the topics. So I think let's look at some questions and then jump in. Let me make myself smaller here. Actually, I'll do the Q&A big. Is mobile development in Python an option? Not that I know of. I'm not aware of any real way to do it in Python, and that's largely because things in mobile are always compiled. Like things for the Android platform have to be compiled, you know, either transpiled to Java or compiled down to bytecode that can be read by the Android virtual machine. And on the iOS side, well, certainly no development over there can occur because that's all Apple proprietary type stuff, which we're actually going to talk about. That's one of the main topics we'll talk about. So I would say, in short, not really. No serious development library that I know of is written in Python. Subject 118 asks why C++ matters for Android development. C++. So the short answer to that is C++ is well supported in Android development, but not usually in the way that you might think. Generally, when people build Android apps, they're not building them with C++. They're building them with Java. However, the Android, I think it's called the NDK, the Native Development Kit, does fully support C++ in Android apps. They're just generally used on the gaming side. Or if you really want to, if you have some C++ module that works well with the actual NDK, then you can use that as well. So that's kind of why that exists. Jules HB asks, what are Swift for iOS development strengths? Do you still see Swift as a long-term viable, considering the uprising of Android cross-platform tools? So I see Swift kind of separate from Android. You know, Swift is specific to iOS and also, well, actually, it's specific to Mac development, I should say. Or rather, it's specific to Apple development. So you see that across, you know, Apple desktop applications as well as mobile. And it's supposed to be a generic language. Like Swift wasn't built just for making iOS apps, although that's what it is used for now. It kind of replaces the old Objective-C, which was just not a great language at all. Kind of an ill-conceived language that was really different from a lot of other languages, and it made it difficult to develop, you know, in iOS. So I think it's definitely long-term viable. I think Swift is the way forward. If you want to be an iOS developer, Swift is going to be the primary thing that you're going to be using, and that's just kind of what it is. And keep in mind that it is an Apple product, and Apple kind of makes you use their products. So you're not really going to get around it. If you want to be an iOS developer, start learning Swift, and then that's what you'll be doing for the remainder of your time. Did you ever use... Let's see. Did you ever use Crystal language? Is it worth learning? I've actually never heard of it, so you should put it in the comments or in the chat or message me on Discord. I would be interested in checking it out. 2MLS, do you like the crate management system Rust uses? So far I do. I think it's really great that I could just copy and paste a thing into my dependencies and it just sort of shows up there, and that's good. I kind of see now. I haven't gone so far in the crate system to know how I can publish or how I can do things like that, but I'm going to cover that in my Rust series. It's just I myself haven't gotten that far yet, but so far I like it. I think it's a good package system. Emma Page asks, what's your opinion on Xamarin? My opinion on Xamarin is that it's absolute garbage. The problem I see with Xamarin is that it doesn't cover a lot of, and we're going to talk about that later in this stream. It doesn't cover a lot of the, it doesn't wrap all the native stuff, and it doesn't make developing things easy because the syntax for representing UIs with Xamarin is XML. And the problem with that is that it's XML over with Java. And then on the iOS side, it's XML-ish syntax with a storyboard kind of on the front end where you can manipulate type stuff. So, and the other thing about Xamarin is that it's written in C#. And C# is a complicated language relative to something like JavaScript. So other than being able to build one app to two spots, I fail to see its value. And I was once part of a project that was written in Xamarin, and it was really, really bad. It had massive differences between the Android and iOS side, and it just ended up being a very bad product. So my opinion with Xamarin is quite low, and I say that having been a part of a project that was in Xamarin, so it's not conjecture. I actually watched a project go really, really terribly that was in Xamarin. So, okay, that's it for the questions for now that I could see. Keep posting your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure that's funny. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Yeah, that's just what it is. I mean, Xamarin came out around the time of like the Corona SDK and PhoneGap and all that kind of time, but there's new tools, and we're going to talk about a lot of them in this stream. So, I'm sure that sounded a little bit like a biased, kind of explanation of Xamarin, but I'm only so passionate about how bad it is because I actually watched it be bad. I actually watched it. I watched people interact with a bad app written in Xamarin. So I'm kind of not happy with it now. Okay. So I have a lot of different talking points, related to, and I kind of want this to be interactive. So if you have any comments, put them in the chat as well. I have it right in front of me, straight ahead, right in front of my face, so I can watch the chat. A lot of these talking points are just stuff I'm gonna kind of go in order, but I'll jump around if I need to, just to cover what I need to cover. So I'm trying to remember, this stream is the state of mobile development in 2019. It's not the state of mobile development in 2005 or, what it might be in 2030. It's what it is right now. So I'm trying to stick to things that are relevant to mobile development at this exact point in time. So it's worth talking about, relevancy. So if you're going to embark on building a mobile app, it's worth knowing how relevant a given platform is. And there's kind of really, in 2019, there's kind of really two platforms. There is Android and there's iOS. And that's really it. As you can see here, I wrote, both are considered alive and well. Android has 76% market share globally, and that's a really large number. And we'll talk about why that number is so high here in a second. On the iOS side, only a 23% market globally, but those numbers get a little closer to 50 if you're in countries that aren't super price sensitive. So like here in America, I think iOS is actually more popular than Android. Well, it's less popular, but I think they sell more units just because here is less price sensitive in other areas. But if you go to countries like, India, for instance, you're going to find that, they're primarily doing Android because people are very sensitive to price there. So that's why Android has a 76% market share globally. It's just because, the cheapest iPhone you can get right now would be like the iPhone 8, and maybe that's like $450, something like that, 480. And that's just way too much. I mean, you could pick up an Android for $50, and if you're really price sensitive and you don't necessarily want or need such an expensive phone, or you're in a place where maybe you can't afford it, then Android's going to be the phone you're going to buy. Even a $50 Android is going to be leaps and bounds beyond like a flip phone, which I don't think people even buy anymore. But you can get yourself a smartphone, for $50, and that's kind of why it's so large. So the reason I mention that is just to say that just because Android has 76% of the market share does not necessarily mean that 76% of your users are going to be on Android. It really depends on where you're targeting. So if you're targeting like European, North American markets, then you're going to want to target these equally. But if you're targeting like developing countries, something like that, then you're probably just going to want to target Android. And that's why I mentioned that. So you'll notice that 76 plus 23% only equals 99. There's also a 1% market share that has kind of these other phone platforms. This would include, the antiquated, let me check here. Oh, good, 720, good enough. The one platform is going to be like the BlackBerry. There are still BlackBerries out there. There's not a whole lot of development being going into it. It's really kind of a niche thing. Like there's only niche markets and industries that are dealing with BlackBerry, and I don't think anybody's developing like major consumer apps, in BlackBerry. So that's kind of dead. The other one is going to be the Windows Phone. That was Microsoft's attempt to kind of penetrate into this massive market we call, mobile phones and mobile applications, and they just got to the game late, and they fed everybody stuff that nobody liked to begin with, and that was Windows user interfaces, with this ill-conceived Windows Phone. So for all intents and purposes, for people developing, it's dead unless it's Android and iOS on mobile. Is Flutter the future of cross-platform? Maybe. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Yeah, isn't BlackBerry B2B now? Pretty much. I haven't seen anybody with a BlackBerry in their hand in years. However, I have seen BlackBerry still relevant in places like government and big corporate. That's still a thing. And that's only because they have massive systems that are built on kind of a BlackBerry communication scheme. And because of that, a business looks at as how expensive would it be for us to swap out all our BlackBerries and infrastructure, with something else. So it's still common to find people with this, but again, it's for somebody building a massively consumable somebody building a big consumer app is not going to want to target that. Let's see. Yeah, that's true. Microsoft completely finished development to convert APKs to UWP apps with easy integration. And that's kind of, the best thing Microsoft can do is just make their stuff compatible with stuff that's already out there. If they want to do good, then that's the way to do it. So we talk about relevancy. It's worth examining this kind of thing that I call fragmentation, and this is something that you're going to have to deal with. You have to deal with quite a bit if you're ever going to be a mobile developer. Is you have to grapple with this problem of fragmentation. And fragmentation is nothing more than you have one code base, but that code base has to work with X number of kind of design schemes and vendor platforms. So fragmentation on the iOS side, not such a huge deal because, of course, iOS is built by a single vendor, and that's Apple. Nobody else on the planet makes iPhones. Nobody else on the planet, builds iOS to their phones or anything like that. So this is purely an iOS thing. And for me, a free software guy, that's really terrible. That doesn't give the user a lot of options. However, from a developer standpoint, it's actually really good. And that's because if you're developing iOS apps, then you're going to be making apps for platforms that you can have a high confidence are going to be up to date and are going to look the same across everything. And you're not going to have to do a lot of if maximum Android API, is lower than X, then don't do this. And because that does happen on the Android side, and it's kind of a pain. So, and the other thing you can kind of depend on with iOS is that the large percentage of running devices are going to be using the latest iOS. And that's because people are kind of conditioned to, as soon as they see a pop-up on their phone that says new iOS version, they immediately go and they click it. So within 2 or 3 days after Apple releases a brand new iOS version for people's phones, it's not uncommon for 70 or 80% of the people to already have that. So if we examine that same thing on the Android side, it's not only is it highly uncommon for updates to be released on time, it's also highly uncommon for those updates to be pushed out to everybody's devices. It's even more highly uncommon that all the vendors that produce Android devices would push out updates in a timely manner. And this is always kind of a problem. And this is where fragmentation continues as well, is, Android has phones that are built by a litany of other companies. So when I speak of Android, what I'm speaking of is what's called the AOSP, and that's the Android Open Source Platform. And that's going to be developed by Google, and that's what Android kind of officially is. When somebody says the term like stock Android or original Android or plain Android, what they're actually referring to is the AOSP. And the AOSP can be seen on display in phones like the Google Pixel and previously the Nexus phones. But beyond that, every vendor kind of takes the AOSP and then they start writing additional stuff into it. So Samsung writes all their UIs and all their stock apps and all this into it, and they change the AOSP. LG does the same thing. OnePlus kind of does it, but theirs is pretty close to stock. And that's all well and good and everything, but the problem with taking the AOSP and making it whatever you think is the best as a company is that you're making it hell for developers to develop against your stuff, because you've changed it so much that users don't get a consistent experience, but they do on iOS. And what I will say is that in later versions of Android, particularly today in 2019, it's not as big of a deal as it used to be, but it's still a big deal because all Android phones look different, but they really shouldn't. They should just use AOSP. But if they used AOSP, then they don't get to tell people, well, this is, we're Samsung and this is Samsung's flavor of Android. So that's the problem. And you may not even get an update. The other thing about Android is as a phone gets dated, it may not ever receive a version that's considered modern. Like there's phones out there that are a mere 5 years old that stop receiving updates. Updates that came out 2 years back. And the reason all this is relevant to you as a developer, I do have a point here. I said all this to say that as a developer, you still have to grapple with the fact that there's 20 different Android versions out there spanning, 8 versions, or 8 like numbered versions. Whereas iOS, you really don't. You just have what it is. But again, it's all trade-off. iOS is a more closed platform. You may not like that. Android's quite open. So lots of fragmentation, and fragmentation kind of rolls us into this idea of, actually, let me read the chat real quick. I don't like stock apps. How dare you not let me delete the NFL app? Yeah, that's just what it is. There's people put their bloat on their phones. People are selling them to do this, and that's what it is. Fortunately, as a developer, you don't really have to concern yourself with bloat apps. You only have to concern yourself with the core, the Android core that's different from AOSP. That's what you have to grapple with. So the reason we talked about fragmentation is because, you know, if you have to make an iOS app that's not so fragmented, but then you got to make an Android app that's super fragmented, and you're writing, you know, 2 code bases and they're really complex, then, you know, there must be better options. There must be cross-platform ways to handle this without having to worry, you know, about maintaining 2 code bases. And so that brings us into this kind of development, you know, point in this stream. So, you know, there's lots of ways to go about development with mobile apps. There is, of course, the plain old native option. And that's where you just grab Android Studio, you know, go watch some tutorials on Java and the Android, you know, APIs, learn a little bit about XML, because that's what you'll be writing your UIs in. Well, actually, Android Studio, especially as of late, has now a really, really nice visual builder for building Android apps, and only recently has the preview for an Android app actually matched what was on the phone. It used to be it would be close. It'd be almost what you saw, but lately it's been perfect. Exactly what you see is exactly what will be in the app, and this is really good for development. And with native, you're going to get this kind of maximum performance. You know, there's no faster, better way to run Android apps than just writing it native, because you're not going to have any overhead. You're going to be interacting with Android APIs directly, and it's going to be the best in terms of performance. So if you're doing iOS, you can well, yeah. So this is another talking point is, if you're on Android, you just download Android Studio, you can build an Android app, doesn't cost you anything, no big deal. If you're on iOS, the first thing you got to do is go buy a Mac. I know that sounds really stupid, but you can't develop iOS apps without a Mac. Period. End of story. So right off the bat, the first thing you got to do is go buy a Mac. And then once you have bought that Mac, then you can download Xcode, and then you can start writing Swift code to make your iOS app. And previously, remember, it used to be, iOS used to use this language called Objective-C, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that, you know, Objective-C, not a great language, and they realized that, they swapped out with Swift, but there's still millions of iOS apps out there that are going to be written in Objective-C. So if you're planning on being an iOS developer and you show up at a shop that already has existing iOS apps, there's a high probability that at least some of them are going to be in Objective-C. That's just what it is. So, but newer apps, they should be built in Swift. I don't know of anybody that's building Objective-C apps, you know, right now, choosing that as the language they want to use. But I suppose it's still possible. iOS, like Android, does have a visual builder, and it is the way to yield maximum performance for your apps because you're writing it native. There's no overhead. It's all great. How good is iOS dev on a Hackintosh? I don't know. I'm not sure actually. If I need to natively develop for Android, I prefer Kotlin. Yes, absolutely. So Kotlin is kind of a new fancy language that's supposed to replace Java on Android. I heard somebody say that Kotlin's the official language of Android. That's not accurate. Android now has 2 official languages. One is Java, one is Kotlin. So they're both fully supported. They're both the official languages, and they're both what you should use going forward. The people that should use Kotlin are people who are brand new to Android development and don't really know any Java. In that case, you might as well use Kotlin because it's a simpler syntax. It'll make building easier. But if you're already a Java developer, it may be harder to get moving on Kotlin just because it's something new. You know, it's always easier to use the stuff that you know than to use something new. Good point. So Pizza just mentioned in the chat here, you know, the open source projects for phone operating systems like post-market OS. So there are kind of, people could build their own operating system. The only problem is, will your mobile operating system work with Google Play services? And I know that people are probably upset that it's tied so closely to Google, but the reality is, if you want people to download your app from the Play Store, then your phone has to work with Google Play services, and it has to accept things from Google Play services, and they need to be able to be installed to your operating system. So there are things like Post-Market OS. There was another one back in the day called CyanogenMod, which was kind of the precursor to what is now Oxygen OS on the OnePlus phones. I don't know how active it is. I think that's a dead project, but it might not be. But the point is, there's a lot of customized Android stuff, but it needs to be integrated with the Google Play services stuff. So we've talked about native development. Now we're going to talk about cross-platform native. And I say cross-platform native because there's also cross-platform not native. And that's going to be like your HTML5 apps, which we're going to talk about later. So with cross-platform native type stuff, you have several options. And this is one where Emma asked earlier about Xamarin. Cross-platform native, Xamarin falls into that category as well. We're not going to cover it because it's not a good product, but the two things to look out for right now on cross-platform native is going to be React Native and Flutter. And React Native is something that's been out for some time now. I want to say React Native for iOS came out in 2013, somewhere around there, and it was a response to Facebook's need to make better apps faster, and so it's a Facebook product. It's pretty stable now. React Native Android didn't come out until I think 2015. I know it came out some period later. I don't know exactly how far later, but a primary benefit of React Native is that it uses web technologies, and that is to say that it uses things you already know about. It uses CSS and JavaScript and JavaScript and CSS, but it doesn't use JavaScript and CSS in that you're making a web page. It uses it to represent what the app will look like natively, and then it converts it over into the target platforms, and then you get an app. And it's important to note that this still produces a real native app, meaning that things you build in React Native, they are written to native user components, and they are using native modules. And this is important because HTML5 apps are not quite like that, but we'll talk more about that later. React Native has the benefit of building to both Android and iOS, and that's fantastic. This means that one code base can just split and go to Android and iOS. And this is quite nice. This is a really cool value prop that makes React Native a really attractive option, especially for companies that are maybe on a budget and can't afford both iOS and Android developers. And the final thing is that if you're using React Native, JavaScript, very popular language, so is CSS, so you're very likely to have that talent on hand already. So if you have a guy that knows JavaScript, but you know that native Android is in Java, then you might already have a guy that can do React Native development. So they make it really easy to get going. There are a couple pitfalls though, and it's kind of the same pitfalls that are in a lot of these cross-platform situations. Is that the first is that it doesn't implement 100% of everything from both platforms, and the way React Native and also the way that Flutter handles this is that it lets you drop down into actual native coding. So you're able to kind of interlace native coding in Java or Swift in with your React Native, but this is a pitfall because this implies that now you're kind of introducing two code bases and to a lesser degree, three code bases, which is to say that you have a common core of your app written in, say, JavaScript and React Native, And then you have these tiny pieces of code. You have tiny pieces of iOS over here, tiny pieces of Android, and then together they make your full app. So is it really 3 code bases? Well, no, of course not. Because when you do Android and iOS just straight native, you have 100% code base, and then you have effectively a copy and paste version that's written in Swift and does it their way. But with React Native, not so much. So you got to it can get messy quick. If you're not careful, you're finding yourself writing a lot of native code in each, even though you're using this kind of cross-platform technology. So you got to watch out for that. And then the other pitfall is that the apps may not look identical between platforms. React Native's pretty good about making it almost identical, but you're always going to have this problem, and sometimes it can turn into a cat and mouse problem, whereby, yeah, you got to compromise somewhere. That's right. But the way, the cat and mouse game that you kind of get into with cross-platform development sometimes is that you'll fix something on the Android side, which will cause something on the iOS side to break. And then to fix the thing on the iOS side causes the thing on the Android side to break. And then you're in this situation where you can't actually solve the one problem effectively. And then you end up having to either drop down to native or come up with a better way. And that's kind of the 2 pitfalls, with React Native. And Flutter has the same, for all intents and purposes, Flutter is just a newer version of React Native that's backed by Google, that uses Dartlang instead of JavaScript. And that could either be a good or a bad thing. Dartlang is supposed to be faster, but Dartlang is also newer. If you talk to 50 developers, maybe one of them will know Dartlang, but if you talk to 50 developers, probably about 20 of them will know JavaScript. So I thought that was kind of risky. Flutter, of course, is a Google-backed product. Dart is also a Google-backed product. And I think this was a way of Google being Google and doing typical Google things where they want you to use their stuff. So they say, you know what, we're gonna use this obscure language that nobody really uses, and we're gonna put this in a competing product against like React Native. And whether that works out for them in the end, I don't really know. I thought Dart was kind of a weird choice, but I suppose if you already know Dart, then this is kind of a good option. But you're much more likely to know JavaScript. yeah, Alphabet. You're much more likely to know JavaScript than you are Dart, and you're much more likely to have people in your office that know JavaScript, instead of Dart. So I have a couple sample apps for React Native I wanted to show real quick. Just give me 1 second. So I mostly just wanted to show the actual, what it looks like. So React Native, sort of, well, that's a lot of stuff. I was hoping for something simpler. Okay, anyways, so, React Native is basically JavaScript, modern JavaScript, of course. And you could see that it uses, HTML kind of representation. And then if you already know React on the web, then making Android apps, iOS apps, super easy, because you can use the same stuff that you already know. It functions the same way. And then you also represent styles, stylesheet.create, and then you can apply these styles to things up here, which will cause them to look a certain way in the app. And keep in mind that, remember, I can't stress enough that this is not an HTML app. So what you're seeing is not HTML. You're seeing the native representation of what HTML and CSS here describes it to be. And this was their major value prop, is to say, hey, come use HTML and CSS, but it won't actually be HTML and CSS when you go to review it. And that's kind of cool. So that's kind of a big thing. And then again, it's called React. Again, this is something else I can't stress enough, is it's called React Native because it literally is the web version of React, but applied to native mobile development, which is really cool. As far as Flutter goes, I have a Flutter application here as well. this once again, it's kind of like JavaScript, but once again, Dart it's not JavaScript. It has syntax that people might not be accustomed to, like override or super, or these type annotations. And this might be kind of intimidating to people because it's not familiar. And this in itself might drive people away to go just use something like React Native with JavaScript just because they already know it. But if you're getting yourself into Dart, this is kind of what it's going to look like. That's what it's going to be. I don't know exactly what this application does. I just took it off the internet, but I mostly just wanted to show kind of how it was laid out. And yeah, Avi asks, is there something like React Native but for Vue? And the answer is no. No, I don't know. I don't think there's like a Vue native. Probably because that product would just directly compete with React Native, and React Native is already a really huge product that's just really popular, that has a lot of big customers. If a lot of people on here use Discord, know that the Discord app is written in yeah. Stop shying at Chase. Yeah, he's being bad right now. I had to yell at him real quick. Thank you for the 40 rupees. Yeah, that would just cause them to compete with React. A lot of like the Discord app on your phone, that's all in React Native, and that's kind of a massive product that is. Oh, there is Vue Native? I didn't know that. Okay, so I guess that does exist. Yeah, Dart was really intimidating for me. Way too many brackets. Looks like it can all be written in a single line because it's so many commas. Yeah, it is intimidating, and I kind of, if you're going to show me intimidating code, then what's the benefit for me to just do it here instead of just in native Android anyways? And that's kind of the problem. You got to make it easier for people. In my mind, it's very important to keep lowering the bar, lowering the barrier of entry into mobile development, or people are not going to use your product. That's just what it is. Colin Patchen adds, I already know Java, but not Android development. So given that is iOS or Android easier, if you already know Java, then native app might be the way to go, because the Android APIs, while they are all written in Java, they are specific to Android itself. So you do have to learn Android APIs, but a lot of just core Java works fine as well. Yeah, honestly, this Dart code looks like Java. It's pretty close. Yeah, it's typed. It uses things like override and extends. Might as well be Java, but that's what it is. So I want to jump down to HTML5 real quick. And HTML5, I don't know how popular it is today. I know that anybody I've ever met that said, you know what, we're going to build an HTML5 app. That's going to be the way forward. Anybody I've ever met that did that, they end up regretting it. And they ended up saying, we can't do this. It's very bad. So, but there are some pros to HTML5 development. Number one is it really is true cross-platform. And that's because you are literally making a web page that you are presenting to people as a native app. And the way HTML5 apps work is you launch a native app which has one command that opens your HTML5 app in what's called a web view. And a web view is nothing more than an embeddable browser inside a native app. And then that's kind of your app. It's definitely, it's native in that you can launch it from the home screen of your phone, but it's not native in anywhere past that. It does use web technologies, which is ease of dev, and it does use web technologies directly. Like you will actually use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it will be rendered as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. However, you'll notice that pro is also a con. A con of HTML5 apps is that it uses web technologies. And that's because like web applications, they're not designed to perform in the same way that like backend applications are designed to perform. And that's because you don't really get to pick you know, you don't really get to pick what somebody's processor is. So you're not building performant applications based on some specific CPU architecture that you know will run fast. You're kind of just building it to be usable. And because of this, at least web views back in the day, they were only single threaded. So right off the bat, if you had a quad core phone and you're running in a web view, you only had access to one thread. And that's not good because a phone needs to use all the cores. You know, you need to do things in a multi-thread kind of fashion. And this was something that you couldn't do on old web views. I think they've solved that. I think latest web views, particularly ones that run Chromium and have access to like worker threads, I think those are now multi-threaded, but it's still not good. But that's the HTML5 app option. It's, you know, there's still a lot of frameworks out there for it. Things like Ionic, you know, are still kicking. Then the primary technology behind HTML5 apps is something called PhoneGap, and yeah, that sounds like a native app with extra steps. It's only native up until the point that it spawns the web view, and then you're just effectively looking at a web page. And the other problem that you run into with HTML5 apps is if you go to build your HTML5 app to iOS, the problem is when you go to submit it to the Play Store, I'm sorry, not the Play Store, the iTunes Store, what happens is Apple has to review your app. And one of their rules is that if you just took a web page and just embedded it in an iOS app, they're just going to reject it. Like, that's not good enough for Apple. So right off the bat, it needs to feel native. You know, they don't have a ban on HTML5 apps, but they need to feel native. They need to give the user the right experience, or they're just going to reject it anyways. So in my opinion, HTML5, choosing that in 2019 for building mobile apps is simply a no-no. I would veer away from it. But you gotta remember that when HTML5 like application frameworks were really popular and were, you know, had a chance of being the next great thing, we didn't have things like React Native. You know, we didn't have things like true cross-platform development. So, you know, in 2019, we have a lot more options than we did in, you know, PhoneGap, I think, was a product of maybe 2011, somewhere around there. 2011, 2012, right after Android came out, it started getting big, and they released like 3.0. The last thing that's worth talking about is mobile game development. And this is kind of the easy one. And that's because when you're building cross-platform applications for the user and you're actually building user interfaces, what you're actually doing is you're using like a native, you know, text box on Android and a native text box on iOS. But when you're doing a game, and when I'm talking about game in this case, I'm talking about like a graphical game, you know, something like Temple Run or whatever. The thing with that is that if you have an image of something, it looks the same on both platforms. That's just what it is. And video games, nothing more than just, you know, high frames per second worth of images, more or less. And what that causes is that when you build a game cross-platform, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a game that looks identical, 100% identical, and that's just because it renders it in a different way. It's rendering it as graphics versus as native UI elements. So much easier. And then this is also where the C++ like NDK for Android comes in, is that that's used quite widely in game development for Android, as well as some of its other things. The most popular of which is Unity. You know, Unity is written in C#, but I believe it gets boiled down to native bytecode that can then run on the Android virtual machine. And then the same is true for the iOS side. But, you know, Unity, very popular. It's completely free under a certain revenue ceiling. Once you hit that revenue ceiling, then you got to buy a subscription to it. It has a variety of platform support, including Android and iOS. It supports a lot more than just that, but remember, we're talking about mobile development. So it, of course, supports Android and iOS. You can guarantee that your game works exactly the same in both platforms. The other competitor for Unity is Unreal Engine. That also works with Android and iOS. That one is free under $3,000 in revenue, but then you got to pay them a 5% royalty. So is that worth it? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Don't know. You got to decide. That probably comes down to like, what's your budget? What's your developer talent? Do you have people that know Unreal already, and so on. And then the one other mention I'm going to make is a thing called Corona SDK. I don't know how popular that is anymore. I know that back in the day that was the way to build mobile games. And I think that's just because they got there first. But then when these big players like Unity and Unreal came out, and they came out with really great tools for building games that work on all platforms, they just kind of steamrolled Corona SDK. The other thing that Corona SDK suffered a little bit for is the fact that it used Lua as a primary language, and that's kind of the only, I think that's the only thing I've ever seen use Lua ever in my entire career, is that game development engine, Corona SDK. Let's see, is it possible to run a mixed Unity game with native UI elements, menus, profile? Okay, so yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So like, when you make a Unity game, there are times where you may have a stylized text box, and then when somebody clicks into it, you may then see the native keyboard come up, or you may see a really small native text box. But in general, you're not mixing these. You're going to use whatever's offered through Unity and through Unreal, and it's going to be rendered the same everywhere. Roblox uses Lua. Yeah, see, I feel like Lua is just for games now. That's it. Yeah, Unity and Unreal are definitely the top dogs. They're massive projects with huge companies backing them. Of course, Unreal, I think, is backed by, at risk of sounding like an idiot, I think it's backed by Epic. So that makes it huge with unlimited budget. So, expect to see both of these products pushed and developed hard, well into the future. I mean, imagine a language with ready to start one. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's about all the content I have. Let's look at a couple of questions. I'm going to read the chat as well. Just make sure I've covered everything. I want to should have hit everything up here. Okay, I was interested in becoming a mobile app developer native, though I see 80 plus, this is Gianluca, sorry, I can't pronounce that. See, 80% of the apps I download are not native, but built with cross-platform frameworks. Do you think native dev is dead? So if it's cross-platform, it is native. So React Native does produce a native app. It's just not, it's fully native. It's not, there's no web technologies. It's only web technologies at the time it's built, and then it gets converted to the native UIs. It uses all native modules. It supports multi-threading. For all intents and purposes, it is a native app in that case. So I'm going to take your question as, do I think people developing just in straight Java or iOS is dead? And the answer to that question is a definitive no. It's definitely not dead. And it's for the reasons I've stated earlier. You do get a lot of differences between apps, and sometimes you really just need the performance of Java with no overhead. And if you already have people on the books, like if you have employees that know Android development and know iOS development, then sometimes it might make sense to just say, okay, we're just going to build these apps, and one guy's going to do one of them, the other guy's going to do another, and that'll be that. But I don't think it's dead. I think for pure native dev to die would require two things. Number one, it would require things like React Native and Flutter to deliver identical products between platforms, and to not have to make people drop down into native coding when they want to use something that their platform doesn't support. I think until they do those two things, it's never going to die. Flutter versus Android. So I'm assuming you mean Flutter versus React Native, because Flutter is Android. They're not the same. So Flutter versus React Native. I mean, I don't have a ton of experience with either, but if I had to pick one today, I would pick React Native just because it uses a language that I'm more familiar with and it's more stable. Keep in mind that Flutter still is the new kid on the block, but it's still very promising. Have I ever heard of containers, Kubernetes for mobile app? I have not. Is that really a thing? If it is, I'd like to hear about it. You should post it on my Discord or in chat here. Okay, I think that's really it. Let me look through the chat here. Okay, good. Unreal's an Epic Games project. So, yep, it is owned by Epic. Blockchain development. We actually have an entire stream dedicated to that here in about 4 weeks, I think. We need an EM OS for phones. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Okay, just scrolling up through the chat here. For React Native, we need to know JavaScript. Yes, absolutely. JavaScript is going to be key for React Native development. So, okay, that's pretty much it. Just a quick review. You know, there's trade-offs when you go Android, iOS. There's trade-offs when you go cross-platform or native. You know, a lot of it's based on budget. A lot of it's based on manpower. A lot of it's based on how quickly you want to get to market. You know, there's also this kind of idea of, you know, it's worthwhile to build it fast. Like a lot of companies have, not so much anymore, but they used to build HTML5 apps just to get to market. You know, they said, you know what, we can build an app really quick just to get out there and get something moving. And then once we get something moving, we can kind of go back and develop it in either native or some real cross-platform, you know, thing. And I'm not actually aware of any major product that is built in something like HTML5. I don't know of anyone out there. I know that there were lots of them, but everybody just kind of bailed and they went either cross-platform or just native. So I'm not sure if there's anything really out there. And then now I've been getting a lot of questions about Python. You know, is Python for apps? Not really. Yeah, new JavaScript engine. Okay, well, I think that's pretty much it. I think we're gonna wrap it up here. If you want to go further on anything we've talked about here, be sure to find me on my Discord. There, we got a big community of a lot of people, about 6,000 people now, and we don't do a ton of mobile development there, but we do have a channel for, well, just for Java right now. I suppose we could make one for Rust or maybe a mobile development channel. It's worth talking about because mobile development is kind of, it's kind of the way forward. Everybody has a phone in their hand. There's billions and billions of mobile devices out there. There's a lot more mobile devices than there are computers, and therefore it is worth looking at it closer. And even if you don't ever want to be a mobile dev, you still got to understand kind of the challenges, because you're eventually going to be in a position where you have people that are doing mobile dev. Maybe you're not doing it, but you got to kind of understand how all those pieces fit together, and it'll help you, you know, be a little bit more well-rounded. So if you want to go further, you know, let's chat on my Discord as well. And other than that, I appreciate everybody coming to the stream. Not a huge turnout. I apologize for the problems earlier. Actually, we've dropped a lot of frames on the stream, about 5%. I'm hoping that doesn't mess up the recording. I may have to download it and re-upload the audio. I'll check that out later. So I apologize for the rough start that we got off of here. I'll try to address that problem before next stream. And then I do have another Rust video coming tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. We'll continue right where we left off, and then expect additional Rust videos in the future there. I have some giveaway stuff. I'm not going to release it just yet, but I have some cool, well, they're stickers, but I'm not going to show them just yet, that I'm going to give away to some people on stream, some people on Discord. So if you want an exclusive Engineer Man sticker, be sure to be on my Discord or show up at the streams, and I'm going to give away some of them. I have about 50 with more coming, so I'll I'll mail those to whoever free of charge at a time in the future. And I'll show you the design here at some point. Other than that, I think that's everything. So I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of their weekend. 2 weeks from now, same time, noon, we're going to be doing Cloud Essentials, which is kind of a redo of a previous stream about getting a website online. We're going to talk about the cloud and how to make it work for you, and then how to just get things online and get moving, run applications and whatnot. So anybody that's interested in web dev or cloud technologies, that's going to be a really good stream for you. So I hope to see you there, and we'll be doing that 2 weeks from now at noon. Okay, all questions are answered. You got your Discord, you got a video tomorrow, stream in 2 weeks. That's it. Have a fantastic rest of your weekend, and I'll see you on Discord or on the next stream. Take care.